Hey, Wendy, the New South Wales state election, and really this is so important, not just for listeners in New South Wales, but people listening to our conversation all over Australia will have their eyes focused on what's going on in New South Wales, because this election taking place at a time when our freedoms, our education system, parental rights, they're all under attack. How are you seeing things for the 25th of March?
Yeah, look, it really is important for the entire nation because New South Wales are looking at, introducing Christian, religious freedom legislation, but they also have made it very clear that they will introduce conversion laws. So both the opposition leader Chris Minns and also the Premier Dominic Perrottet have said that they will do this. So of course there's been quite a big pushback because the concern, particularly for parents, is that they might be considering a Victorian-style conversion therapy legislation, which I think most people listening now know the Victorian-style laws restrict parents and counsellors as well to have any conversation with their child that doesn't affirm gender transition. So prayer is banned in Victoria for a child who is concerned about their gender. So there's been a big pushback on that, and so far, both of these leaders have said that they will not go down the Victorian style of legislation. But at the same time, they're both saying this is a very complicated area of legislation and we need to, protect people of their rights to have conversion therapy. So it's of big concern. And I think what we see is that there's an opportunity here in New South Wales before they introduce conversion therapy laws to have an inquiry into what we see as this huge problem nationwide. And the big problem is that children are being moved along into both medical but also psychological, what we would say is abuse, because they've actually been moved into an understanding that they can actually change their sex. They can move from being a boy to a girl or a girl to a boy, and it's cruel because it can't happen. And so we think that there's an opportunity here in New South Wales post the election with both these leaders saying, we see that there's a problem, but we are going to introduce, let's have an inquiry. Let's really look at what's happening and let's look at what is best practice, both globally but also here in Australia. And so we think there's an opportunity for them to, lead the nation in what is truly conversion therapy and what is actually just good practice.
This is so challenging, isn't it? And, you feel like the wool is being pulled over eyes, where you've got this thought that we can solve one sense of abuse, the thought of electric shock treatment to treat people who might have an unwanted sexual attraction, but then we'll swap that with another even more abusive form of letting kids go through all sorts of transition issues. One form of abuse for another. But let me touch on this, Wendy Francis, getting your thoughts, because, as you say, Chris Minns, the opposition leader, supporting a conversion bill, and probably will look similar or even harsher than that which is already in place in places like Victoria. But you've also got the government Liberal leader, the Premier, Dominic Perrottet, also saying he's going to support that too. So if you're looking for who are the goodies and who are the baddies, how do you discern?
So what we're saying to people in New South Wales is look to the upper house. So this is an insurance policy, I guess, if you can get good people into the upper house, because then they can help to block bad legislation. And so Lyle Shelton is running. Family First is not actually running itself because there wasn't time to get it registered, but he is running as an independent, and of course he is Family First. And then there's Mark Latham as well, who has put forward some really good parental laws in the past that have not been successful. And so these two men in the upper house would actually be able to potentially block some of the bad legislation. Perrottet is talking about, we can't have people using food deprivation or electric shock to try and convert people out of a sense of who they are sexually. Well, food deprivation or electric shock, it doesn't even happen, Neil. It doesn't happen in our nation. It would be totally illegal to do this. And so they're hiding behind this really radical, drastic action that happened, in the past, not actually in churches. Like, churches were not doing electric shock. This was actually in medical practice. We need to realise that as well. But they're hiding behind that to say, this is what we need. And there's no evidence at all of that happening. If there was, of course, the Christian church would be the first ones to call that out.
Wendy, no doubt you're spending a fair bit of time in New South Wales around the issues that are developing for the New South Wales state election. You're coming across people, you're in conversations continually around these sorts of things. What sort of things are parents expressing to you? Because it seems to be that parents, even though lots of listeners to this program might appreciate the parents who are under at risk here and the churches are being targeted, but how are parents approaching you and asking you about these things?
Well, people are really worried about it because they don't want their children taken off them for some misguided notion that them saying to their child, no, we're not going to go down this path, that somehow that is abusive. And in Victoria, that is exactly what it's called. But there's other things that parents are really worried about too, Neil. They're worried about the education curriculum. They're worried about the cost of living, to be honest. There's many things that are concerning them. And, these are not easy times in our nation and around the world. And so the people in New South Wales are looking for a strong government. This is one of the areas that matters to them most, because if you ask any parent, what is your biggest concern? It is for their children. And so this certainly is one of the big ones. So we are there a lot. We've already run a couple of forums. We've got another one tonight in Parramatta. We've got an online forum coming up in a few days on Thursday night. And then we're running one in Liverpool as well. So we are getting around, and we're mostly trying to, again, what I say is we're mostly trying to target this upper house, because we believe that is where we're going to actually be able to stop some of this really terrible legislation.
You've got these targeted election candidate forums. You mentioned one on Thursday night. It's an online forum. So while you can't get to every electorate, every community in New South Wales, at least you can make yourself available in an online forum. So this Thursday night, no doubt, will be a very important one, Wendy.
It is, and we have Lyle Shelton and Mark Latham both fronting up to that, because we want them to be able to explain to people how important it is that this upper house is the focus, I guess. I was really surprised and I guess delighted to see that Lyle Shelton drew the number one on the ballot paper. That was exciting because it's in the norm. It's not going to be easy for an independent to actually get up. But being in the number one spot, that's a wonderful thing. It certainly gives him an opportunity to speak up as well, because the media are always interested in who's in number one. And so even running in an election like this, it opens the opportunity for people to draw attention to some of the big issues that are happening for parents. And all this around the parental rights area is sort of uppermost in our thoughts. So the forum will focus on some of those issues, but it'll also talk about the economy. It'll talk about a lot of other things as well.
So many people look to the Australian Christian lobby for some level of wisdom and guidance. And as you say, you've got these special speakers, and Lyle Shelton, who is known to all of our listeners, what a champion of Christian faith. And I think it might be the prayer of everyone listening to see Lyle Shelton in on the crossbench in the Legislative Council in New South Wales. Mark Latham, though, who doesn't consider himself to be a Christian, but he's the biggest defender of what we can see as an attack against Christians. One Nation. Thoughts here, Wendy, for people who might be concerned about Mark Latham, people who might be thinking, what is the Australian Christian lobby saying about how the vote should go on the 25th of March? Thoughts here around Mark Latham?
Yeah, such an interesting character because, as you say, not a man of faith. And, I think he's very close to the kingdom, to be honest, and I think he'd say that himself. So he seems to be one of these commentators that, like a Jordan Peterson type person, who not a person of faith, but recognising the wisdom of a biblical lifestyle, and also just a very logical thinker. So we believe that his parental rights legislation was brilliant, and we would like to see that reintroduced. We certainly would. So, yeah, not someone of faith, but very close to the kingdom, and I believe with a sense of understanding of biblical principles and prepared to actually follow them.
And Wendy, the thought that, you don't tell people how they should vote, but when you're talking about what their upper house, that Legislative Council crossbench might look like, with the retirement of the likes of Fred Nile, and with the necessity of having some sort of a Christian friendly voice there that will actually be able to block really dreadful legislation that we're talking about. This is something that people ought to be really thinking very carefully about.
I think the whole of our nation should be praying for someone like Lyle Shelton. Someone like him to get into our parliament would just be, yes, another Fred Nile. And don't we need more people who will go the long distance, not veer from the right or the left, but just stay that very strong biblical truth, stay on that path. So I would encourage everybody, whether they're in New South Wales or not, to really pray that Lyle Shelton will be elected, but also that I guess people of faith will be prepared to actually step up and say, I will commit myself to being concerned about politics, to being concerned about what is going to come down the line for our children, because it's not just for us, Neil, it's for our children and it's for our children's children. We want them to have the right, to maintain the right, to be able to bring their children up in the faith. And I don't get me wrong, that is very much in the crosshairs at the moment. There would be people who would want to take children away from families that are bringing them up in a godly way. This is really serious stuff.
Wendy, we started our conversation just a little late today. If you're happy to continue on a little longer, unless you've got some other important appointment that you've got to be at, but I'd love to be able to ask you about some other issues that are going on. Are you available to stay with us a little longer?
I am, Neil. I'd love to do that.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break and we'll continue our conversation in just a few moments. Wendy Francis is our guest. Wendy is the Director of Politics for the Australian Christian Lobby. Wendy, if we're talking about this New South Wales state election, it's now less than 2 weeks away. Challenging time for New South Wales listeners to be thinking carefully about how they vote. I want to ask you about the NSW Votes website, the link that people will be able to get at the ACL website. What sort of detail will listeners be able to access there?
So they'll be able to see what sort of how the current MPs have voted in past really important votes, I guess, private members' votes and those sort of things. They'll also be able to see some interviews. So we've got an interview from Mark Latham and Lyle Shelton up there. They'll see all the details about the candidate forums, and they'll be able to read up on some of what we see as the key issues. Because another one of the key issues in this election is the whole gambling issue. And so Perrottet has promised to actually bring in a card that will be sort of a prepaid card to try and help particularly the most vulnerable who are losing, and I'm telling you, our nation loses over $1 billion on pokies, and New South Wales is the epicentre of that. And so we believe that's also a key issue. Certainly there's also the conversion therapy, if we've talked about, but the euthanasia and abortion, those sort of things, you'll be able to see on there how your members have voted in the past on these issues, and also the actual party's policies on these issues. But there is also there's a video up there of my interview with Tim Costello, who has been for a long time the advocate to reduce problem gambling. And so it's a brilliant interview from him up there as well. There's also actually, I think, interesting too, there's also understanding the voting system in New South Wales, because sometimes it can be confusing from state to state because it changes. Certainly where I vote in Queensland, it's a very different political system. So we always try and put up a video just explaining how the voting system works in each state.
So there's issues around policy, there's issues around how to vote, there's issues on all sorts of different levels, including those candidates and those members of the New South Wales Parliament and how they have voted on previous legislation. So a very, very good resource for listeners to be able to access at acl.org.au/NSW votes.